You want me to just take it, Jeff?
No, I'll introduce you. Okay. Welcome everyone to our White Collar Week Tuesday night speaker series. Our guest and tonight is Mike Kimelman, a friend and an expert on crypto and Bitcoin, and he has a interesting story. And Mike, I hope you'll tell us some of your background and your story, and certainly what brought you to this group and into our community, and then kind of roll into telling us what's going on in this crazy time of Bitcoin and FTX and all of that, and what we should or shouldn't be looking for and looking at. Just a couple of notes I'm going to and announcements I'm going to make first. The first is that this is the holiday season for us, and the only time of year we do ask for donations to help us keep the lights on during the year. So I'm putting it in the chat. If you would be kind enough to make a donation, if you can, that's great. We're gonna kind of be asking for them all month long, so it's not like you need to rush out and do it right now. But thank you for that. Let's see. On January 10th, our speaker is going to be Elizabeth Kelly, and she's a criminal defense attorney who represents people with mental health disabilities. So that is a tremendous service that she provides. And she not only flies all over the country and consults with people who and their families who are facing criminal charges, but with these kind of debilitating situations, but she also sometimes is first chair, and she's available anytime and for sentencing and for reasons like that. So she'll be with us in January. But tonight we have Mike Kimelman, and so I'm going to turn it over to you, Mike. And if you want to use the screen share, that's up to you. But it's all yours. And you have 30, 40 minutes. Go for it. Thanks.
Awesome. And thank you very much for Jeff for having me. It's good to see everybody. I spent quite a bit of time in this white collar group early on. After my sentence was concluded, I had the good fortune of meeting Jeff and getting to know him quite well, and found a home in the white collar space, both to help me readjust to society and get back on my feet, but also to help others, which was nice. And I've always found it a very warm group. I think Jeff's an amazing leader who has done phenomenal things for people by starting this group, and is just one of the guys who has the biggest heart that I've seen. So he's been a friend and a confidant and a mentor in many ways when it comes to, as we all, I think, have, trying to navigate this insane system and trying to make sense of the world as we come back into the world. So I'll give you a real brief on me. It's probably less interesting than the SBF FTX saga, but in my case, it does lend to quite a bit of understanding. I was originally, I'll just give you grew up in Los Angeles, moved to New York after law school, took a job with Sullivan and Cromwell, which is one of the big New York firms, was an M&A lawyer for several years, got tired of sleeping under my desk, as people do at some of those big law firms, saw everybody having a lot of fun, or at least more fun, and probably making a lot more money in technology or finance. I wasn't great at coding or tech, ended up in finance, which was well suited to me as somebody who liked to play poker, and actually went to the horse track quite a bit in high school, and probably had a little bit of a gambling degeneracy bug in me. Ended up at a couple of different prop trading firms and hedge funds, started out as an analyst, worked my way up to a portfolio manager, eventually started my own fund, and blew that up pretty spectacularly in the financial crisis. And a lot of that was my fault. Some of it was my partner's fault, who had worked for a hedge fund called Galleon. And if you remember, and if you're familiar with finance, Galleon was run by a gentleman named Raj Rajaratnam, who was a big hedge fund guy. And he was sort of the top tier insider trader, biggest insider trading case since Mike Milken. And my partner had worked for him directly. And when he came over to my firm, I hired him not knowing that he got fired by Raj, but thought he was some standout star, and they'd done quite a few things together that were not kosher and were illicit. I at best, turned a blind eye to some of that or what I had heard, and ended up getting prosecuted for one count of insider trading. He had given me a tip. I was a 5th level tip B. I can give you a legal explanation of why it was an outrageous case and I shouldn't have been prosecuted or found guilty and the rest of it, but at the bottom, and when all is said and done, this guy had a lot of red flags on him, and I choose to ignore them because I was greedy and wanted to benefit from his information and from his connections in the space. He had gotten us a lot of money, had tremendous contacts. We had about $250 million under management at its peak and had done quite well, but none of that mattered when the FBI kicked down my door, more or less. I had an FBI SWAT team raid my house at 5 a.m. in Larchmont. I had 3 young kids at the time, still do have 3 young kids, but, kids inside the house, was married, and was, just in a state of shock when they carted me off in handcuffs in front of my family. I was a lawyer, and I'm not sure some of you may relate to this, but I had no idea about the criminal justice system. And even after 2 years of pretrial with some very good lawyers, I still had no idea about the criminal justice system. And in my mind, there was no direct evidence. This was a ridiculous case. The government had come to me afterwards and said, hey, plead guilty on 1 count of conspiracy. We know you're a peripheral player here. Get out of the case. We'll recommend no jail time, no fine. We don't want you here. And in my head, it was, how could I possibly be guilty? I don't think I really did anything. And again, it's a gray area. This is a much longer discussion if we were to have it. But, even the feds were sort of like, yeah, there's not a lot of evidence. We don't want you there. And I said, well, how can I be, prosecuted or be found guilty if there's not that much evidence? And went to trial, and they sat me in between my 2 partners and said, partner, friend, partner, friend. There was about 7 informants who were wearing wires who came in, testified, pointed to, my partner. And it was a big guilt by association case, but it was also a case that sort of opened my eyes to the criminal justice system and how it works and how, some judges or former prosecutors intend to favor them, as well as how a jury in the end, is not going to look at a allegedly wealthy Wall Street guy, when Occupy Wall Street's happening right down the road and we're in the middle of the great financial crisis, and hear how this guy made 100,000 in an hour or whatever happened. And some of these guys are making 30 or 40 a year. I was not, to put it mildly, a sympathetic defendant, and I was convicted of that 1 count. I was sentenced to 30 months in prison, which, when you tell people in prison, hey, I got 30 months, they call it a skid bid. When you're the one actually going through it, obviously it doesn't feel like a skid bid. It feels like a lifetime. I think, 6 months, anybody will learn their lesson going to, an institution like that. But either way, that 30-month sentence was shortened somewhat through ORDAP, good behavior, and the rest of it. So I did about 21 months in total, including, I think, 3 of those or 4 of those were at a Bronx halfway house, which, as some of you may know, probably the only thing worse than a Bronx halfway house is prison. So either way, went through that experience, was able to fortunately get out in one piece, rebuild my relationships with my children. Unfortunately, my marriage did not survive it, but have gone on to do several things. Did some stuff in the entertainment biz when I first got out, had sold a few things, a script and some other things, produced a documentary or 2, got back into some real estate speculation, as well as was fortunate enough to meet a gentleman who was very big in the crypto space, in the blockchain space, named Charlie Shrem. He was at the time head of the Bitcoin Foundation. This is 2014. And he kind of dragged me down that Bitcoin rabbit hole, that crypto rabbit hole, and saw a lot of interesting things, including helping him. He was one of the people who got prosecuted for the Silk Road case, if anybody is familiar with that. But that was a very big case in the crypto industry early on. And he went through, ended up going to Lewisburg, which is where I did my time. We became fast friends. When he got out, we started a blockchain investment and advisory firm and have given since about 2016 advice to basically companies wanting to get into the blockchain space, companies that are native blockchain companies, just companies, anything related to blockchain. We've been there. So we've done dozens of deals, been fortunate enough to write a book with him. Wrote a book about my time through the criminal justice system with my case called Confessions of a Wall Street Insider. That did pretty well. If you're curious or interested in more, I suggest you check that out. Recently, we published a book called Mastering the Basics of Bitcoin and Crypto, which is, my nickname for it is Bitcoin for Boomers, because it's a book I wanted to write for my dad, who would constantly ask me questions. And I would try to point him to different resources on the internet or explain it to him. And most of the stuff out there is either, they can say it's approachable, but it still requires quite a bit of technical expertise, or at least understanding the lingo. So most people get lost when you start talking mining and hashing, rates and the rest of it. This we tried to write in a very simple and approachable way about the space to get people to understand it better. Because I do think even with all of the FTX stuff and everything else, this is a generational thing. It's probably going to be here for a while. It'll iterate in different ways. It's going through, a pretty severe bear market. I've witnessed 2 of these bear markets before this. I could tell you this one feels probably worse than the other 2. But I do think Bitcoin especially is very different from crypto. And I'll tell you why during this call. And has some long-term potential, because again, we live in a world where we're blessed to be in America, despite all of its flaws and everything else, where we are the primary reserve currency. So the dollar is still the most powerful currency in the world. It's used to settle oil transactions and just about all foreign trade. And we have the power to hit the print button, which the Federal Reserve does. So we don't have to be as fiscally or monetarily responsible as everybody else in the world does, because we can print money. And we saw that during COVID. We printed something like $8 trillion or more. During the great financial crisis, we printed, it turned out to be closer to 30 trillion in guarantees that the Fed made. So that gives us a lot of leeway. I don't want to get too off topic, but I do want to hear from you guys as far as, and you could just give me a real quick show of hands, how many are at least, cursorily familiar with FTX and the SBF story and what's going on and have heard? Okay, good. So, what you've seen in the papers, depending on where you get your information from, may be very different from my perspective and from some of the things I've seen. What you guys probably all have, which is helpful, is a skeptical view somewhat on government and perhaps on the justice system and maybe even finance from going through the great financial crisis and some of these other things. So, some people will spin things differently. I know a lot of the people involved in this case. Like I said, it's my area, so I understand it pretty deeply. And it's still a mystery to me, to be very frank. Like, there's some things going on that are difficult to understand or explain, especially in light of my experience with the criminal justice system and probably some of your experiences. So what I'm going to do is I'll give a background. I'll try to move pretty quickly through this because I think it's more interesting if I'll take some questions from you guys if you have questions, or try to drill down on certain areas if you didn't understand it. But I'll give you an overview of what happened, what took place, and what are some of the implications and what it means for the future. Let me share my screen. Make sure you guys can all see this, right? All right, good. Give me 1 second to move this. All right. So, it's almost hard to explain how this started in some ways. I mean, it's easy to give you the official explanation, but one reason this didn't entirely surprise me is because I was approached very early on to be an investor in FTX. And, the sort of backstory, which I got and everybody else got, and again, I kicked myself for not doing it because they valued it at like $40 million. So extraordinarily cheap. This thing went from 40 million to 40 billion in 2 years. So, that's what is that, 1,000x or something like that. So in this case, my skepticism or due diligence probably cost me a lot of money. In the end, maybe it worked out because this thing's a zero now, and anybody who invested money is getting zero back if they didn't cash in. But the thing that first sort of raised a yellow flag for me was his origin story. Was he worked for Jane Street, which was a very well-known good hedge fund, but he was a very junior guy at Jane Street, like an analyst, left to start a hedge fund called Alameda Research. And the way it was described was Alameda made its money, and a lot of the startup money came from something called the kimchi trade, which was basically arbitrage. So arbitrage is just taking the price of something somewhere, and when the price of somewhere else is different, you just make that spread. So if something's trading for $10 here, call it in the US, and $20 in Japan or Korea, which is where they got the kimchi name for it, you would buy it in the US, sell it in Asia, and make that $10 spread. So it's a risk-free trade. Now, they said he made tens of millions of dollars doing this kimchi trade. But my market experience was when there's that big of a spread between two things, it narrows really quickly. Nobody's going to sit on the sidelines and be like, oh, it's trading, $10 here, $20 there. I'm going to watch this guy make tens of millions of dollars. Why not do it yourself? And when everybody does it, or a lot of people do it, spreads narrow. That's what markets are supposed to do. So that part didn't make any sense. I'll just begin with that. Either way, right after that, he went off like a rocket ship. So they raised a little bit of money. Alameda quickly got a reputation as being the smartest, brightest, best in the space. Whether that was warranted or not is one thing. He had tremendous PR, probably was very, probably pretty savvy, but somehow built this into a monster, and then started a exchange. So he had a hedge fund and an exchange. Now, in traditional banking, you would, especially after at least the Dodd-Frank law and the great financial crisis, you can't really have a hedge fund sitting right next to a bank or an exchange, because, you're going to end up crossing a Chinese wall, what they call it, or used to call it. I don't know if that's the PC term anymore, but you can't just trade information and go back and forth with positions and stuff like that. You have to have real separation. They never had that. And that's what really became their downfall in all of this, or at least the customer's downfall. So you had, this Alameda Research, which he was really running until fairly recently. And then he was also running the exchange. And the exchange came out with the FTT token. And this is one of the things in crypto that can be a little bit dicey depending on how it's done. In this case, exchange tokens were some of the better known tokens because they actually had real utility. You can use the token to get cheaper trading commissions, to do all types of things with an exchange. But again, this was a token that he basically issued and had functional control over, that these guys were valuing on their balance sheet at whatever number more or less he wanted to value it at. Now, it traded publicly, but it had a very tiny float, meaning there was, 1 or 2% that was out there. And I'm not sure that's the right number. It's probably a much higher number, but it's not a big number. And so when you have that very small float, all it takes is somebody buying a little bit and it goes way up. So he took tokens that were worth, in reality, if you had to sell them, probably not that much, but he took a lot of the supply off and then bid it up so that these things were now worth $20-30 billion at one point. And he was able to value on his balance sheet these illiquid, not heavily traded or properly priced tokens at the full amount. So if he had 10 billion in liabilities, he would have 10 billion on his, asset side of his balance sheet. But the problem was a huge part of that was in these illiquid FTT tokens. Now, during bull markets, nobody cares. People just buy and are happy. Nobody asks too many questions. Things look great. But beginning in May of this year, we had the Luna Terra collapse. So that's in May 22. You can see it down there. That was an algorithm. I'm not going to get complicated, but an algorithmically traded stable coin that a lot of hedge fund guys loved. Thought you could get a 20% return just by holding it, a risk-free return. Moral of that story is there's no such thing as a 20% risk-free return. That went to zero. And when that went to zero, it really triggered something in the entire industry. It set off a chain of contagion, where people who, owned Luna or had borrowed Terra, then had to pay back those loans, except now they had worthless, tokens. So they couldn't pay it back. So they had to sell other things. People got loans called. It just set off a domino theory. Whoops, let me go back to. All right. So that collapsed, which caused a hedge fund called Three Arrows Capital, 3AC, to collapse. So 3AC was the best and brightest in the space, best hedge fund out there. Another one of these things which was probably built on, I don't want to say smoke and mirrors, but new space, guys who are relatively savvy, didn't deserve the reputation that somebody like a Stanley Druckenmiller, or Stevie Cohen, or somebody in traditional finance who had built up a reputation over 20 years deserved. These guys, did well for 2 or 3 years in a bull market, made a fortune. So these guys were heavily levered as well. And when Terra collapsed, Luna collapsed, it blew them up. So they had borrowed, they lost money on Luna. Suddenly they have to liquidate and have to sell and can't meet their obligations either. And they go out of business. That led to a major cascading effect. So it's just a contagion at this point. Now, at this point, functionally, I'll say FTX was probably insolvent, and probably bankrupt. But what they did was, certainly didn't admit that their balance sheet had holes in it. They went out and sort of portrayed themselves as the JP Morgan of the space and said, we're going to buy Voyager, which was an exchange that went bankrupt because of these two things. They didn't have enough money to meet their obligations. They had all types of loans they had, taken or given out that never got paid back. So now Voyager's bankrupt, BlockFi is bankrupt, all these other centralized firms in crypto are bankrupt. And if they declared bankruptcy and went out of business, what people would realize is, FTX had taken loans or given loans to these companies. And now, if FTX couldn't get its money back, FTX would be bankrupt. So they tried to buy them to basically prop it up and not have to pay back those loans or not have to admit that they had a balance sheet hole. That song and dance lasted from July up until about November. In November, the whole thing unraveled, and it started relatively, relatively simple. CoinDesk, which is like the Wall Street Journal of crypto, the probably best known publication, put out an article where FTX was trying to raise money. And somebody had leaked their balance sheet that they had given out in this money raise to CoinDesk. And CoinDesk wrote an article saying, look, the majority of the equity on its balance sheet are these FTT tokens. Like, this is not a real, this is not like dollars or treasury bonds or commercial paper or things that you could easily buy and sell, liquid, assets. This is a token controlled by FTX. So it's got tremendous conflicts of interest. They own more than anybody else, 5 billion or more supposedly. And if they tried to sell any of that, it would collapse the price of the token from $80 to wherever. It's $1 today. So, it would collapse the price. This is where it gets really interesting from like a Machiavellian strategic point of view. So CZ, Changpeng Zhao, known as CZ, is the owner of Binance Exchange. Binance is FTX's biggest competitor. So it's like Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley or something like that. CZ had received a bunch of these FTT tokens when he was one of the original backers of FTX. And he, cashed out of his investment, got dollars, but also got these FTT tokens, about $500 million worth. And I think CZ understood that FTX was probably bankrupt or insolvent on paper. He also did not like Sam Bankman-Fried. SBF, or Sam Bankman-Fried, is the guy who, started and ran FTX. And the reason he didn't like him is because SBF was going to Washington and the SEC and Congress and lobbying for a bill that would have made a lot of other firms in crypto fall under the, either be outright banned under regulator review or at least be subject to a lot more regulation. And it was typical, regulatory capture, crony capitalism, where his centralized exchange would be given, sort of a free rein and become like the de facto exchange out there. And all his competitors would be in trouble or be, more heavily regulated. So CZ and many people in crypto were very angry about this approach. It sort of betrayed the fundamental principles of crypto, which is decentralization and self-custody and censorship resistance and all that. So CZ saw an opportunity to strike when FTX was weak. And he announced to the, via Twitter and which everything takes place on Twitter these days, of course, that he was going to sell the 500 million in FTT tokens. And as soon as he announced that, boom, FTT fell off a cliff. And then it became really obvious that, if these FTT tokens at $60, it was questionable whether they were solvent. At $20, they had to be insolvent. And everybody knew it at that point. And what happened was a classic run on the bank situation. So people started pulling their money out of FTX. They had 10 billion, 11 billion or more of customer deposits, and people all pulled those deposits. So as that happened, they had no choice but to say, hey, we can't even meet customer withdrawals. We don't have enough money to do that. And then at that point, they were at the market's mercy. And CZ kind of finished, his kill by saying, okay, we'll buy you. We'll take you out. We'll buy you just like you were ready to buy everybody else. And I knew at this point, because I knew, CZ didn't like Sam Bankman-Fried. And, there was probably a big enough mess on the balance sheet that he wasn't going to buy it. But what he did really was delay anybody else coming to buy it. And then like a day or two later, he announced the balance sheet is beyond a mess. We're pulling out. And at that point, they were dead on arrival. And that was more or less the end of FTX. At that point, it was a quick bankruptcy. And then they brought in, the guy who did the Enron bankruptcy. And shortly after, he basically said, this is the sloppiest, messiest thing I've ever seen. I've never seen anything like this. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, really. There's a lot of other questionable things regarding this that sort of, are as good a guess as yours, as mine, or anybody else that people are going to try to figure out. I'm sure you've heard, that there are people who will tell you, well, I'll tell you, forget about other people. I'll tell you there's four likely, call it, I don't know, four likely explanations for how this seemingly nobody, young kid was able to raise, billions and billions of dollars at a $40 billion, almost a $40 billion valuation, take over the space, have senators fawning over him and regulators and everybody else. And, give a lot of money to politicians, including by some estimates, maybe $1 billion to mostly Democrats. There are other people who may have given to the other party, but people say, it's at least a couple $100 million and probably close to $1 billion were given to Democratic candidates in the DNC. So here are the four speculative and again, highly speculative theories I have of possibly what happened with this guy. The first is, probably the most conspiratorial, which is, this was basically a money laundering operation using, they were in charge of a lot of the Ukrainian donations. They were in charge of a lot of the funneling. It's a perfect offshore, Hong Kong based originally, which is known for money laundering. Perfect way for Chinese, Ukrainians, you name it, to launder money to themselves, but also, possibly to U.S. politicians. That's the more tin hat one, which very well may be true, but nobody can say with any type of assurance that that's what happened. So the second one is that it was a intelligence community honeypot. So if you're familiar with the term honeypot, law enforcement or the intelligence community will set up a fake company, and basically do business knowing that everybody coming through that business will be a future, they can prosecute them or flip them as an informant. And, if you really want to get a handle on crypto, FTX was a perfect offshore, knew everybody, had its handles in everybody's business, a perfect way to really monitor money laundering and crypto and anything else that was going on. So that's also, conspiratorial, but I think very likely that there's some truth to that somewhere. The third one is this is just a lucky guy who was in the right place, right time, and, was aggressive and somehow made billions and billions and billions of dollars and was sort of a moron and didn't really know what was happening and somehow lost it all. That's the persona he's trying to portray now to some degree, that, hey, I was a philanthropist. I was just trying to do my best. Crypto crashed. We didn't have great controls in place. I'm so sorry. I can't believe this happened. I'm going to try to get all the customer money back because the customer money is gone. And that's where it clearly seems to be a crime. And I'm a little bit at a loss as how he hasn't been arrested yet, or at least, talked to law enforcement. Because you can't really use $10 billion of customer funds to go fill balance sheet holes at a sister hedge fund, which is what he did. Those customer funds are supposed to be segregated, custodied, they can't be touched. This guy took, anybody who deposited money with him and used it to pay off his own loans. And that's, I don't know, under any justice system I've seen, that's, I don't want to say life in prison, but probably at least 10, 15 years, if not more. So, and the fourth is, hey, it's sort of a combination of lucky guy. It's just, this was a once in a lifetime storm in crypto and we didn't have the systems in place and got blindsided, which is very similar to 3. Just, I don't know what's happening. Something happened. But either way, the questions that are really in my mind, besides, how compromised was he, is how is it, I'll compare it to my case. I mean, I made a $30,000 trade that I got charged with, and I had an FBI SWAT team, a literal SWAT team, come down, raid my house 5 a.m., grab me out, in front of my kids, and got sentenced to 30 months in prison. This guy stole $10 billion in customer funds, and he's going to the New York Times Deal Book Summit, and he's on stage, and he's getting, applause from people watching it. Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, the blue check journalists and corporate media are giving this guy a full brand rehab across the board of, he was trying to change the world and his plans got upended. Instead, he's a lot more like Madoff. I mean, that's really who he is, for lack of a better term. But I've never seen anything like the press cover for a guy like this. I mean, normally there's a story where you would just rip him to pieces. Feds can make their career yanking him out. The fact that that hasn't happened yet, and there could be a couple different, explanations. I mean, I was on a Twitter Spaces today. Twitter Spaces is like a, I don't know how to describe it. It's just an audio, and anybody can join, but they have certain set speakers. And Sam came on, and he's been on dozens of these. And he's just talking, he's talking. There are other things where he's been caught texting people like, oh yeah, that whole philanthropy thing was bullshit, but people see through it now. I mean, I've never seen a defendant who is so open and willing to appear on, blogs, chats, TV interviews, conferences. I mean, anybody who's got a legal team would tell you first off, like, are you out of your minds? Like, you can't do that right now, especially because he more or less confessed multiple times in early on to this. But the fact that he's still doing it, and I can make, again, another speculation that, look, this guy's probably facing a life sentence or at least 25 years. He may have nothing to lose by being unorthodox and saying, his main story is, I don't know how this happened. It was a once in a lifetime storm. I just want to do everything I can to get the customer money back. That's the only thing that matters. I don't care about anything else, and it's such an act. It's such a ridiculous act, but, he's going to go into a judge and he will cooperate too and say, I did everything I could. Like, I just didn't realize what was happening and it happened so quick. I didn't have Cienter. I didn't have the intent to steal it. I was gonna, I thought it would just be borrowed for a couple days. We'd make it right. And he's like a young kid connected to the system. So again, he can get 10 years or a relatively soft sentence that's not a Madoff-like sentence by taking this approach. But I do think it also leads to speculation that this kid is protected or he was planted by the intelligence community, which is very possible. I don't know anybody who could raise the type of money he raised and the speed he raised it and have no questions asked and then still be out there talking and doing all this without being, at least interrogated by law enforcement. But I also know, I don't know, but I will speculate that he will be used to hurt crypto further. So I could see, and I don't know if you saw Maxine Waters, if you know who Maxine Waters is, the congresswoman, she was like, "Oh, Sam, I hope you can come testify in front of Congress next week." And I mean, it's, it was like asking your boyfriend if he would take you for a slice of pizza, the way she was speaking to him. Eventually, I think he will go before Congress, and it's going to be another act of, yes, you guys have to crack down and regulate and really break this system because, I would have never been able to do what I did if there were real regulations and laws and all the rest of it, which, there may be a shred of truth to that, but anybody can falsify statements, create a backdoor, which he did in the accounting system and hacked into it to be able to transfer from the exchange to the hedge fund without anybody noticing, as well as, there's a dozen other things that are bizarre about this case. Like the day he declared bankruptcy, 600 million went missing. It got hacked in and stolen. Now, I don't know, what TV or what news you guys watch, but that's like the biggest story of all time in and of itself. And I haven't seen a single report about the hack in about 3 weeks. So there's a lot of really bizarre and strange stuff about it. That's the background. That's sort of my thoughts on it. Before I do questions or do anything else, let me stop the screen share. Is that at least semi-understandable? I hope I didn't lose too many people, and at least gave you a little bit of background of where we are, what's going on. I'm happy to talk too about, if it's helpful, ways you can avoid being taken advantage of if you are in crypto as far as losing money. Happy to talk about why Bitcoin is very different from crypto. But I'd like to at least open the floor for now and take any questions somebody might have about the story, about anything else you heard, or just random, on a different topic related to it or anything else. I'm happy to talk about anything.
Mike, thank you so much. It's the first time I even understood what the progression was, and although I do have to tell you that personally, someone has to just explain to me like what crypto and Bitcoin are. But
yeah,
but maybe we'll get into that in a couple of minutes.
Okay.
So if you'd like to share or ask Mike a question, please put your name in chat. And let's start with Bill and see where this goes. And thank you so much, Mike.
You're welcome.
Michael, thank you. I really appreciate it. That was really interesting. I have two questions, or a two-parter. This whole thing reminds me a lot of the early 2000s, where everything was, pets.com was getting run up to God knows what.
Yep.
Okay. The whole vaporware business. What kind of role do you see that is played by like the financial press or like the financial Facebook, CNBC, one, and people like Kathy Woods, et cetera. But also, could you tell me where the original valuation came from, or how the original valuation for Bitcoin was arrived at? Okay, because everybody says, "Oh, it's a currency." I'm like, no, it's not a currency. Okay, at least to me. So if you could explain where that initial valuation came from, and on my earlier question, that'd be great.
Yep. So, and this ties into the Bitcoin versus crypto a little bit too. Those are colloquial terms for lack of a better explanation right now. Bitcoin is a unique token or currency. You can call it a currency, you could call it a store of value, a medium of exchange. It's a little bit all of those things. And crypto is just everything else in the space. So people differentiate between those two. And Bitcoin is by far the most decentralized, the most secure. It's got other unique components to it. The way it's produced, it's done through a proof of work mining system, which means you basically, for lack of a better term, convert energy and computing power to tokens and get rewarded for tokens for basically solving an algorithmic puzzle, a mathematical puzzle. To your question, Bill, the original price, Bitcoin is different in that it didn't really have an original price. It was mined and was released on the internet, and anybody could have set up a mining operation. At that time, you just needed a computer and needed to run a Bitcoin node, what it's called, and you would have been given Bitcoin. Then eventually there were places you could buy or sell or trade Bitcoin. So it was a pure market that developed the price for it. And that price back then was extremely volatile, and it stayed extremely volatile. So, it's had multiple up 1,000%, down 80% cycles. But it's different in that it wasn't a big pre-mine like most of crypto is today. So Ethereum, which is probably the second best known crypto after Bitcoin, had a different idea, wanted to do a different type of token, wanted to really have something that could do what's called smart contracts, which are just, automated execution of code. If X happens, then Y will happen, that Bitcoin didn't have the same capability to do. But Ethereum and pretty much every crypto after this was subject to like a big pre-mine and set price. And by a big pre-mine, I mean, people just came up with tokenomics more or less out of thin air, but try to defend it in some way and say, hey, we're going to issue 100 million tokens at a price of $1. And because we created it, we're going to keep 20 million of those. And that's what differentiates it in some ways from Bitcoin. It's also the consensus mechanism. Like Ethereum started proof of work. It just recently became proof of stake. And then there's a couple other different ways of coming to a consensus that, hey, this transaction is valid. You're not double spending the money, meaning I'm not giving you, Bill, 20 coins and then also giving Fred the same 20 coins. And that creates that blockchain. So each transaction is then attached to another transaction. But I don't want to get too technical on any of this stuff. That's the difference mostly between Bitcoin and other crypto. And it can also be used, like you said, you may consider it a currency, and it's not great at being a currency at this stage because it's too volatile. But eventually, according to many people, who are Bitcoin maxis is the term, who believe Bitcoin is going to be a reserve currency or compete with the dollar or oil or gold, or just be a parallel currency that can be used within a closed system. You got to wait until it hits a price of whether that's 200,000 or $1 million, and you have less volatility. Because right now people don't want to spend Bitcoin if they think it's going up. So maybe they'll spend a little bit of it, but it's not great as a currency. What it is good as, or at least was before this year somewhat, is a store of value. And again, it's way down. But if you look over the last, 5, 7, any time period really, for more than a year or two, it's up quite a bit. So it's been a good hedge against inflation, a good insurance policy on the financial system coming to pieces, or the further deflation or devaluation of the dollar. So that's Bitcoin. Remind me of your first question. Oh, 2000, yeah, pets.com. Absolutely. The whole system is set up that way though. So if you go on CNBC, and you called it, I like that, the Facebook of finance, I call it bubble vision or something like that. It's no different. People make money, when people are buying things. So you'll never see CNBC be super bearish unless everybody else is bearish, because you're not going to get Ameritrade and all these other people to advertise on it. It's still an advertising run model. So you're not exactly getting, the same information or the same, caliber of research that you would get if you were a hedge fund paying hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to, analysts and whatnot to produce proprietary research. This is for the fans. This is for, mainstream. So it's definitely very different. And of course, they want those headlines. They want it to go up. Just like it felt like during COVID, CNN had like the death ticker. You could almost hear people rooting for it to go higher. And I know that sounds morbid, but if it bleeds, it leads is sort of the heart of any financial press, media, you name it. And so in this case, yes, they were very much rooting, but they're also conflicted a little bit in that traditional finance likes it, but doesn't like it, right? They want another way to make money because it's gotten harder to make the fees they're making. And they thought crypto would be it and still may be it, but it also threatens the traditional model in some ways. So there are still a lot of skeptics. I mean, there are more people in traditional finance I know who hate, Bitcoin and will never touch it or crypto than almost anywhere else. And we'll see who's right in the end, but it's definitely has a cheerleader approach to it. And it got really stupid over the last year. I wrote a note to, so I do a private coaching financial group, and I also do an occasional newsletter. And I wrote a note in November of 21 saying, this is insane right now, move to cash. And I meant traditional markets, but I mostly meant crypto and everything else too, because you had these cartoon pictures of monkeys called NFTs. And, NFT, the technology, can be very different from NFTs, in their current iteration. But you had cartoon pictures, JPEGs of monkeys selling for millions of dollars, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars that are easily reproducible, had no real scarcity or utility. And when you saw that, and when I saw every 23-year-old or 22-year-old or my 15-year-old son being like, oh yeah, Julian flipped his for 15 grand that he bought the other day, I was like, all right, this reminds me of exactly what you said, Bill. In 2000, when you get into a cab, and your Peruvian cab driver would tell you he's got 16 houses, and he's flipping this and that. It was the same thing. And whenever you get that excess greed, that excess speculation, it always ends badly. Maybe not permanently, but there was too much leverage, too much speculation, and we're seeing that being drained from the system now. I think in the end, it'll be a good thing. I think there was a lot of leverage. And as SBF showed us and some of these other firms, a lot of bad actors in the sector. And as those are removed from the sector, in the end, it'll be stronger. I mean, crypto really is one of the only places, for better or worse, that functions like a free market. If you look at the difference between what's happening now versus what happened in 2008 with the banks, when the banks got in trouble and were completely irresponsible, it was us, the taxpayers, that were on the hook for it. Hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars, because we were allowing them to keep their profits, but we socialized the losses. And right when they got into trouble, the Fed and the government came in with TARP and everything else and saved their ass. In crypto, there's nobody like that. So when you get a bank run, if you're not responsible, lights out. That's what happened to, FTX. That's what happened to Voyager. That's what happened to a lot of these hedge funds. So what we're going to see is an actual recession and an actual cleaning out of a lot of this deadwood and speculation, which we haven't seen, unfortunately, in our broader economy and markets in decades. And that's why it's so painful in the bigger economy when that happens, because we've had the Fed, anytime there's a slightest downtick, throwing money into the system, with the government coming in to bail people out. So I like the free market aspect of it. I don't like that it helps facilitate fraudsters and people who have bad intentions. It'd be great if the code, and people are talking about, rather than asking for regulation, is there a way to do on-chain proof of reserves? So you could see exactly what the guy's balance sheet looks like, proof of liabilities, proof of assets, and really do it, which is what blockchain's for, in a way that allows, open source monitoring of these firms and have a quicker and better, accounting for what's going on. And it's possible. I think it's going to be a little bit difficult because you can't ever underestimate the ability of humans to F things up. and or to do things under the table, and you could say, hey, here's the balance sheet, let's put it on the chain. But if you have off balance sheet obligations like all the banks did, or SBF did, it's a little hard to track it. But that would be the goal. That would be a really big improvement on what we have in traditional finance if they were able to make it work. Sorry, I dropped on for quite a bit.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Bill. Craig.
Mike, that was awesome. Thank you so much. And to your point about people not wanting to spend Bitcoin, made me think of the guy who bought pizza way back in the day with Bitcoin, and however that would be worth to this, to this day.
Millions,
millions, especially when it was at its peak.
Totally.
So I'm guessing there's going to be a lot of regulation in the crypto space as a result of FTX imploding. Do you have any idea what that regulation would look like? And then how will that impact the crypto space?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. I think it's a really tough tightrope to walk, because the difference between crypto and sort of what we have here in traditional finance is crypto is a lot more global. So if you're familiar with game theory, like, a lot of people say, hey, we'll just ban Bitcoin, or we'll just ban this, and that's fine. The US can do that, and they'll just be less competitive if this keeps going and becomes something, big, because Singapore, Switzerland, Japan, a lot of other countries, Dubai is a real hotspot right now that people are flocking to. The people who have had clarity on the regulatory front and also have rolled out the red carpet for people that want to get involved in this space have drawn a tremendous amount of human and financial capital. So we could say, hey, we're going to be really tight, really strict, make everything as difficult as possible. And people, for the most part, will just give up on the US and move. At least people building in the space and people I know. The reason I don't think that'll happen either is because, again, banks and hedge funds want to make money, and they see this as a way to make money. So BlackRock, which is the biggest asset manager in the world, with tens of trillions of dollars, just recently offered the ability to buy crypto and Bitcoin to their clients. Fidelity is a powerhouse that's offering it to their clients. So, we have a quasi government that I don't want to say is run by these firms, but these firms have tremendous influence. The Goldmans, the Fidelities, the BlackRocks. They're not going to allow Congress, who they give money to, or the president, to completely decimate a sector and ruin their potential upside. So I don't think it'll be too severe, but I do think they're going to do things which benefit them, just like during COVID, Amazon, Target, and Costco, and all the rest of the big firms, were essential and did tremendous, and all the small businesses were shut down. It's going to potentially be like that. Whereas if you're a small, builder, a small developer, and you don't have the money to put up a big bond or get licensed, like the BIT license in New York is a perfect example of this, what might happen. And the BIT license was done, several years back. Everybody in New York thought they were so brilliant. We're going to make it so tough to open up a crypto business in New York, and you're going to have to be licensed and verified and bonded and all that shit. And all people did was say, all right, I won't do business in New York. So every firm, you try to join and they're like, oh, sorry, you're in New York. We can't allow you to join. And then, again, regulatory capture. The guy that started all this then went to the private sector and sold his advice for millions of dollars to any firm that wanted to get licensed, and was able to get firms licensed. So I think the BIT license is a great example where Congress should be cautious, because, again, if we just make it impossible, people will go elsewhere. They won't care. And I don't think they'll make it impossible, but I do think they'll try to make it more difficult. But crypto also has a decent lobby that's starting to get more and more active. And so, you got to play the game. I've been telling them to do this forever. I mean, they wanted to have their own system, their own parallel track and everything. And that's great, but you're still in the US, you're still subject to US laws and to society's sort of, approval in some ways. So you got to play the game. And the game in the US is lobbying and donating to politicians and having PR firms and doing all of that, excess costs to play the game until you have a bigger foothold. And I think when enough rich people, enough firms, are playing in this sandbox, it becomes much more difficult to ban it or to get rid of it. So I don't think anything's coming anytime soon. And I think, we'll see what onion layers get peeled back with SBF, FTX. If it turns out, that they were working in conjunction with politicians and intelligence community or whatever, it's going to make it tougher to pass, laws because they'll seem compromised too. So I don't think I would adjust like my investing philosophy based on regulation, but, crappy companies that really had no purpose in the space other than speculation, those are dead. Those you need money to be printed like crazy, speculation, all of those second, third, fourth tier companies, I think are toast. But the good companies and the good platforms and protocols, I think will do okay.
So basically what you're saying, Mike, is if you can afford to have your name put on a sports stadium, that's pretty good.
Yeah. Which is the death kiss for any firm, especially in crypto. I mean, I can't believe how many people were the Staples Center, crypto.com. We know them pretty well. We've worked with them and, they did a $700 million deal. And I was like, that's nuts. Like, well, how are they going to recoup $700 million? And, I got a lot of flack in one of these founders groups I'm in where the token ticked up enough that it made like $2 billion that day. And they're like, oh, they're already 1.3, positive. Meanwhile, then it lost about $15 billion in the next 6 months in a straight line. So, people are like anywhere else. When you make a lot of money, they want to sponsor the Formula One cars. They want to sponsor the stadiums and get the box seats. It's usually a sign that the company's not really run that great. Because if they're spending stuff like that, it means they're probably spending like crazy everywhere else and just don't have any idea.
Thank you, Craig. Fred.
Thanks for the presentation, Mike. It's still a little confusing to me, and I guess
Yep.
maybe the problem is, and you can answer this question, that calling it a currency might be a misnomer because a currency usually is tied to a government, a country, a subdivision with an intrinsic and an extrinsic value, which is either tied to gold or floated based on the value of the country's economy.
Yep.
And it sounds to me like it's not really a currency at all. It's almost like more like some kind of security. I can't really call it that, but is that a good way to look at it?
So most of the companies that issued tokens in 2017 absolutely were securities. The way it was done to raise money. Now, the smart ones didn't put that on the front of their prospectus and say, hey, we're raising money using this token. They would say it's a utility and it's got utility value apart from raising money, and we're not raising money. That's just part of, you want to buy the token just like you would buy tokens at Chuck E. Cheese or a video game place or frequent flyer miles or anything else. It has utility. But most of them that were raised in that ICO, that initial coin offering process, were securities. Different things can be a currency. Bitcoin, I think, absolutely is a currency. The difference between Bitcoin and what you described is that and this is what makes Bitcoin Bitcoin and why they're proud of it, is that it's not connected to the state. It's not connected to any centralized entity. And so you don't need permission to use it. Now, the money I have in my Bank of America account, I may think it's my money, but when I got arrested, it got frozen, without sort of anything happening, without me being convicted or anything else. They froze my accounts. New York State IRS can take your money out of your account, before you're even charged with anything if they suspect something. So what makes Bitcoin, one of the values that it has is that it's not connected to any state or centralized entity. It's just math. It's math money. It's based on formulas. It's never been hacked before. It's the most powerful and secure computing network on the face of the earth. But that's Bitcoin. Again, Bitcoin's very different than all these other things. And all the other things that are deemed currencies or assets, some of them may not be, because, like FTT is a perfect example. On paper, it looked pretty decent, but in reality, as soon as somebody sold it and broke that like artificial, prop that it had, it became close to worthless. And so how can you value that on your balance sheet at millions and billions of dollars when, if it was in the market, it would be worth a thousandth of that. which is what, frankly, some firms did too. In 2008, 2009, the banks, hedge funds didn't want to mark their balance sheets that they had the CMBS on and the CDOs and sort of other private companies, because if you marked them to market, they would have been insolvent. So they kept those, artificially levitating in order to not be deemed insolvent.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, I'm just reading some of the questions or whatnot. But yeah, to Fred, I mean, the basic story that you should take away from this is you can't have two entities that are, doing similar things, but have very different obligations. One was to the customers, one was just a hedge fund trading firm sharing and commingling assets, which is what they were doing. And they were doing it based on creating out of thin air to some degree a token that didn't have remotely the value that they ascribed to it. And so when that token got valued properly, boom, they were insolvent. That's the 2-sentence takeaway from this.
Thank you, Fred. Debbie.
Okay, I got a million different questions. I've been following Tom Bilyeu. He's been interviewing all sorts of people on crypto. So I've got all these different things coming at me. But I read something today where Kevin O'Leary made a comment about the fact that he believes that he will get all of his money back, but guilt should not be assigned until the FTX's statements and Alameda's, I guess, are audited. What's your take on that?
The last part you mentioned, guilt should not be.
Yeah, I think it was a comment to media where everybody's saying, and I heard you repeat it as well, that everybody feels that Sam Friedman should be in jail by now, or at least have been arrested. And his statement was that he didn't feel that anything should be done until the financial statements could be audited. This is where I get confused. I'm an accountant, and it just sometimes it doesn't make sense. What do they anticipate finding going through an audit of financial statements versus what the actual blockchain says?
Yeah,
should be.
Yeah, I don't think. I think Kevin Leary is an idiot when it comes to a lot of this stuff. Just to be frank.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not even sure how much he knows in real business, but he definitely knows nothing about crypto. I'd say 0 chance he gets all his money back. But the audit comment, it's not a false balance sheet or a puffed up balance sheet that's the issue. The issue where the behavior becomes criminal is when you take customer funds, for lack of a better term, steal customer funds. You could call it borrow or whatever euphemism you want, but take customer funds to pay off other debts or obligations you have. Like, that's a pretty cut and dried case of fraud. Whether it's wire fraud or anything else, you just can't do that. It's just like when hedge funds raise money and the guy buys a car with the money that's raised or anything else, those guys go to prison for years. This guy took $10 billion in customer funds. That's an audit will prove that he took it. But he's on tape saying he sort of, repositioned or didn't understand how much was missing. Like, he's made enough comments where it's clear that he did that. So I think, Leary's just trying to, I don't know.
He is a spokesman for FTX.
He is. And again, I'm all for, people making a case beforehand before jumping to a prosecution, but there's been a lot of evidence that have already been revealed, including tons from his own mouth. But it would be different if it was also, the guy probably still has lots of money. He's very connected. He's in the Bahamas. How tough would it be to charter a jet to Russia or to some other non-extradition country? I know they wouldn't let me stay in the Bahamas, if I was doing this. So there's something weird there. That's where I think the intelligence community, payoffs or donations to politicians gets a little funky. Like there's clearly some type of preferential treatment going on, unless the feds are just like, hey, let's sit back and watch this guy talk. Because the more he talks, the more, ammo we have. But I don't think he's going to trial. I think he's going to cooperate and just try to, sweet talk his way that I'm a lovable kid who tried to do altruistic things and save the planet, and got in over my head, and he'll cry and weep and beg for 10 years.
Cool.
Out in 7 if he talks to Jeff. And he's young, so 37 is again, rich parents, connected. He's not gonna die in prison, which there are probably people who lost their life savings who hope he does.
We'll see what happens to them at Stanford after all this.
Yeah.
Mike, it's 8:15, so
Yep.
so we have to stop. If it's okay with you, we'll just keep. I'll stop the recording, and we'll thank you for speaking. And anyone who wants to ask questions, if it's okay for a few minutes, we'll just keep.
Yeah, that's fine. You're welcome to drop my email. If people want emails or whatever.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, go ahead. What's your contact information?
You know what? I'll just put it in the chat if I can.
All right, you might, and I'll have it in the notes too on the
Yeah.
on the.
It's really just the easiest one is mike@dekryption.com, but it's spelled a little funky, so it's with a K.
Oh,
like
Try to get fancy.
like
yeah.
a Kardashian.
Yeah. Exactly.
All right, Mike, thanks so much. It was incredible, and I am gonna stop the recording.